There's one thing the rare men whose prostate never bothers them past 80 all seem to have in common, and it isn't good genes, and it isn't luck, no matter how much it looks that way from the outside. I assumed it was both of those things for years. I was wrong, and it took me a long time to actually find out what the real answer was. I'm 83. I spent 4 straight hours last weekend helping my son-in-law move a shed across his backyard, lifting and bending the whole afternoon, and it never once occurred to me to worry about how my prostate would feel about it. I'm not telling you that to brag. I'm telling you because for a long stretch of my 70s, an afternoon like that would have ended with me sitting in the truck, uncomfortable and irritated, wondering why my body kept betraying me at moments that mattered. For years, I assumed comfort at my age was simply a matter of genetics, the same lottery that decides who keeps their hair and who doesn't. Either you were built with a cooperative prostate or you weren't, and there wasn't much a man could do about the draw he'd been dealt. I watched some friends stay comfortable well into their 80s, and others struggle constantly from their late 60s on, and I chalked the whole difference up to fate. There's a specific kind of resentment that builds up in a man who believes his own body is simply working against him for no reason he can address. I remember standing at my friend Walt's 70th birthday party, watching him move around the backyard all afternoon without a single complaint, while I quietly counted the minutes until I could sit somewhere close to the bathroom without it looking obvious. I told myself Walt just got the good genes, the same way some men keep a full head of hair into their 90s while others go bald at 30. It never once occurred to me that Walt might simply be doing something different day after day that had nothing to do with the cards he was dealt at birth. That assumption held until my neighbor, a physical therapist who spent her career working with older patients on pelvic and joint issues, mentioned something to me over the fence one afternoon while I was in obvious discomfort after a long car ride. She told me plainly that a huge amount of what men my age experience as prostate trouble isn't really about the gland itself failing with age. It's about chronic, low-grade inflammation accumulating in the body over decades, and that inflammation doesn't discriminate. It settles into whatever tissue is already under strain, and for a lot of older men, that happens to be the pelvic region. I brought that idea to my own doctor at my next appointment, half expecting him to correct her. He didn't. He confirmed it and added something I hadn't considered. The men who report the least prostate discomfort late in life tend to be the ones with the lowest overall inflammatory load in their bodies generally, not necessarily the ones with the smallest gland to begin with. Size and comfort, he told me, aren't nearly as tightly linked as most men assume. Inflammation is often the real variable sitting underneath both. That reframed the whole question for me. I'd spent years treating discomfort as an inevitable consequence of an aging gland, something fixed and unchangeable, when the real driver, at least a meaningful share of it, was something with an actual lever a man could pull, day after day, meal after meal. My doctor explained it in a way that stuck with me. Inflammation, he said, is the body's alarm system running when there's no actual fire to put out, a low hum of irritation triggered by years of processed food, poor sleep, carrying extra weight, sitting too much, that never fully switches off the way it should after a real injury heals. In a younger body, that system resets itself fairly efficiently. In an older body, especially one that spent decades accumulating the everyday habits nobody thinks twice about, the alarm just keeps humming in the background, and pelvic tissue, already under more mechanical strain than most other places in the body at this age, tends to be one of the first places that hum turns into something you can actually feel. It's not that my prostate was uniquely unlucky. It's that it was sitting downstream of decisions I'd been making my whole life without connecting them to it at all. For years, one number ran my life, the PSA. It would tick up a point and I'd lie awake the whole night, certain it meant the worst, picturing the biopsy, the knife, the end of everything. Then someone finally told me the truth no doctor had. That number doesn't measure cancer, it measures your prostate. And as we age, it climbs mostly because the gland is simply enlarging, benign, swollen, and uncomfortable, not the worst. The number was scaring me half to death over something ordinary. And the prescriptions they push to shrink it? They can flatten your drive completely, soften everything, quietly take the man right out of you. I wasn't willing to trade that away. There's a gentle way to support that gland, keep it comfortable, a healthy size, without surrendering any of that. Keep getting checked every year, of course. At 83, that number doesn't own me anymore. I finally have peace. Let me show you what gave it to me in this video. And if you want the simple support I personally use, there's a free presentation linked in the description below. What my doctor pointed me toward was increasing my intake of fatty fish and omega-3 fats specifically, because omega-3s carry a well-documented anti-inflammatory effect throughout the body, and that lower overall inflammatory load is associated with steadier, more comfortable prostate function in the research he'd been following for years. He was careful to frame it exactly that way: comfort and inflammation, nothing more dramatic than that. And I've come to appreciate how much that honesty mattered to me later. I started eating salmon or sardines twice a week, something I'd rarely bothered with before, treating fish as an occasional restaurant order rather than a real habit. My wife found a few simple ways to prepare it that didn't taste like punishment, and on the weeks fresh fish wasn't practical, I added a fish oil supplement instead, keeping the habit consistent even when the fresh version wasn't available. I layered 2 more pieces around that core habit because my doctor was clear that inflammation responds to a system, not a single food eaten twice a week. First, cutting back significantly on fried food and the heavily processed snacks that had crept into my routine over the years, since both add directly to the same inflammatory load I was trying to bring down. Second, a short walk most mornings, since staying physically active is associated with lower systemic inflammation generally and steadier comfort specifically in the research my doctor described to me. I also started paying attention to sleep, going to bed at a consistent hour instead of nodding off in my armchair in front of the late news and stumbling upstairs an hour later, half-rested and irritable the next day. My doctor mentioned that poor, irregular sleep keeps stress hormones elevated in a way that directly feeds the same inflammatory pathways we were already targeting through food, so fixing one without the other meant I was working against myself without realizing it. None of these individual pieces felt dramatic on their own. It was only looking back after a few months that I could see how much they'd added up together. I gave the whole combination close to 3 months before I noticed a real, sustained difference. Not just a good week here and there, but a consistent shift in how my body felt day after day. The first month felt like nothing at all was happening, honestly, and I nearly gave up on the fish more than once, telling my wife it probably wasn't worth the trouble of cooking something I didn't especially like. My whole family gathered for a reunion at the lake back in June. 3 full days of standing around a grill, walking the dock, sitting through long dinners, and I genuinely never thought about my prostate once the entire weekend. My youngest granddaughter asked why I seemed so relaxed, and I honestly didn't have a quick answer for her. I think about a man named Perry who wrote in after hearing this explanation. 78, a retired electrician who told me he'd spent years assuming his discomfort was simply worse genetics than his neighbors, never once considering inflammation as a separate, addressable factor. Once he understood there was an actual mechanism behind the difference, he said it was the first time in years he felt like he had real agency over how he felt day to day, instead of just comparing himself unfavorably to men who seemed to have gotten luckier. Perry told me he started keeping canned sardines in his pantry specifically because they required no planning, no defrosting, nothing that would give him an excuse to skip a week. He said his wife noticed the difference in his mood before she noticed anything about his symptoms directly, mentioning that he seemed less irritable on car trips than he had in years. What stayed with me most from Perry's story was something he mentioned almost in passing near the end of a long email. He said he'd spent years quietly comparing himself to his neighbor, a man roughly his own age who never seemed to complain about anything, and privately resenting him for it without ever saying so out loud. Once Perry understood inflammation as the actual variable, that resentment just evaporated, he said, because it stopped being about who got the better draw and started being about what each of them happened to be doing differently. He told me he'd since started walking with that same neighbor most mornings, the two of them finally talking about it honestly instead of one man silently assuming the other was simply luckier. If you're on medication for your prostate, your heart, or your cholesterol, please hear this clearly. Nothing here replaces what your doctor has prescribed, and you should never stop or change a medication without talking to them first, especially anything related to blood thinning, since fish oil can interact with certain prescriptions. Keep up with your regular checkups exactly as scheduled, and mention any new supplement to your doctor before you start it. What I want you to walk away with is this. If your prostate genuinely feels fine at this age, You may well be one of a kind, but not because of luck alone. The men who stay comfortable tend to be managing something specific underneath the surface, and inflammation is very often that something. Once you know that, the whole problem stops feeling like a lottery you either won or lost. Here's what I settled on: a few drops a day. And let me tell you why it works. One compound calms one signal, but a swollen prostate answers when several are calmed at once. The growth signal, the inflammation, the pressure inside it. So what I use concentrates them, working as one, the way the research actually uses them, not a single ingredient pretending to be enough. A gland that stays comfortable and a healthy size, fewer trips, and the quiet of no longer fearing that number. It leaves the man fully intact, none of that flattening the prescriptions can do. It's linked right under this video, go look for yourself. It won't replace your doctor or your yearly check. It supports the biology right alongside them. I'm 83, and that number doesn't own me anymore. I think about the man I was, chalking up every uncomfortable afternoon to bad genetics and bad luck, never once looking for a lever to pull. And I think about the man I am now, who finally understands that comfort at this age has an actual mechanism behind it, one he can influence with what's on his plate. I didn't get a different body than the one I started with. I got a calmer one, and at 83, that's turned out to be more than enough. If you've ever discovered that something you assumed was fixed and unchangeable actually had a real lever behind it, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one myself. And if this kind of honest explanation is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe. There's more of it coming every week.